About 2 months ago, the YouTuber Bricky made a video titled Suspension of Disbelief and Ed, and Eddy, where he talks about the suspension of disbelief as a concept, and I have some issues with it. To be clear, I'm coming at this from the perspective of a fan. I like Bricky and I've been watching his videos for years, and usually his videos are on point. I just happen to disagree fundamentally with this one. The video will be linked in the description so you can watch it for yourself and make sure I'm not misrepresenting him. Alright, let's start some beef with a channel more than 200 times my size. Real quick, if you think I'm doing a good job, like and subscribe for the algorithm. Twitter page and Discord server are linked below, and join Patreon for early access. Alright, let's do this. Bricky's video is made up of 2 sections. In the first half, he talks about suspension of disbelief as an overarching concept, how it works, how to use it, that kind of thing. In the second half of the video, he builds on the concepts from the first half and ties them into 2 episodes of the cartoon Edd, and Eddy. Before I really get into any serious refutation, what exactly is the suspension of disbelief? Bricky gives a pretty good definition in his video, but I'd like to describe it very simply. Suspension of disbelief is when you accept something as true in the context of a piece of fiction that would either be impossible or unreasonable in the real world. Bricky gives the examples of the Force from Star Wars, zombies in general, and faster-than-light travel in science fiction. These are all things that just don't exist in reality, but are components of their respective pieces of media that we don't ever really question. We suspend our disbelief in the existence of these things in order to properly experience a story that contains them. Okay, we all on the same page now? Good. Bricky makes the claim that the suspension of disbelief can only work as long as 2 specific factors are at play, and this is where I take issue with the video. And not only do I think his prerequisites are just wrong, but they form the foundation of his entire video. These factors are that, according to him, the fantastical element can't be over-explained and should be kept vague, and that it must be fun. I'm gonna go over both of these individually, but first, I'm gonna let you hear what Bricky has to say on over-explanation.
Let's talk over-explanation first. If something needs to be taken for granted, the Force, FTL travel, zombies, whatever, then both you, as a person, and the media itself cannot explain it. And if you do, it has to be the vaguest explanation possible.
Okay, so here's the thing about that. No. There really isn't a nice, delicate way to put this. That statement is just completely wrong. And do you know why that immediately set off alarm bells in my brain? Well, I'll tell you, but first I need to talk about something that's pretty much the go-to thing people describe when talking suspension of disbelief. Magic. Now, magic is one of those things that's inherently unreal and fundamentally changes whatever universe it's a part of. But not all magic is created equally. Instead, magic tends to be divided into 2 categories, soft and hard magic, though it's more of a spectrum than a clear division. To greatly oversimplify, a hard magic system is one where the rules are pretty ironclad. The magic is pretty set in stone in regards to how it works and how it doesn't. A soft magic system is looser, vaguer, and generally more mysterious. Each of these styles has pros and cons as far as writing goes, but I wouldn't say that either version is inherently superior. However, I happen to be a big fan of hard magic systems. I love it when a story has magic that's just as grounded as every other element in the story, and I feel it allows for a talented writer to really capitalize on their ingenuity. So when Bricky says that the more you explain things, the less effective the suspension of disbelief, that was completely contrary to basically my entire experience as a lover of fiction, which has been around 20 years at this point. But I think I know how he came to this conclusion. See, after making this assertion, Bricky moves into the horror genre and explains how a general lack of explanations typically leads to a scarier story. But here's the thing, that's something that's endemic to the horror genre specifically. See, one thing that talented horror writers know is that nothing scares the shit out of us like our own brains. The fear of the unknown is one of the most common fears out there and even forms the basis for other fears such as the fear of the dark. That's because our brains fill in the gaps with things that are in all likelihood scarier to us than anything a writer could come up with. Good horror uses this natural paranoia within each of this to augment its own sense of dread and suspense. But not all media is trying to freak us the fuck out. Plenty of stories don't rely on the fear of the unknown to fuel engagement, and that's where this particular argument falls apart. Now, on the opposite of the spectrum, a vague magical, supernatural, or scientific concept could also fuel a sense of wonder and mystery. But what if that's not what the story is going for? Now, maybe Bricky doesn't consume a lot of media with a focus on intricate world building, but as a self-proclaimed fan of science fiction, I have to imagine he's encountered stories that examine how something that doesn't exist in the real world would impact a world in which it does exist. A great example of this would be a book I read in high school, Fragment by Warren Fahey. The premise of this story is that a group of scientists discover an island which had existed in isolation for something like 500 million years, causing its own ecosystem to evolve separately to the rest of the world, specifically adapting to an environment fraught with danger where pretty much everything is trying to kill everything else. Much of the story focuses on how these creatures could have evolved and what physiological differences would result in an ecosystem where survival is substantially more difficult. It even touches on how the scientific community and world governments would react to such a discovery. And while I'm sure that some of the science is contrived, pretty much everything is explained in a logical and coherent manner. Not a whole lot is left up to the imagination, and just about everything is explained scientifically. But that never takes away from the excitement of the plot, nor does it negatively impact my own engagement with the story. Bricky's assertion that explanations make the suspension of disbelief less effective come from his own biased perspective and the incorrect assumption that because the examples he highlights work better with softer, more vague systems, that therefore softer systems are just better in general. And that's just not correct. At all. And as I said earlier in the video, Bricky's videos are usually on fucking point. The dude is legitimately smart. And considering that he makes a living essentially doing these 10 to 25 minute video essays and reviews primarily discussing video games, basically a more targeted version of what I do on this channel, I find it very hard to believe that he's never found engagement in some form of media that goes for a more explained, meticulous usage of the suspension of disbelief. So I think chances are he just made an oopsie here. He had the idea and just kind of ran with it without really going through the rigorous process of trying to thoroughly scrutinize it before adding it to his video. And genuinely, no hate there. I've done the same thing in the past, and chances are anyone who makes content that's both persuasive and analytical will end up making that mistake at some point. But let's move on a bit, because he uses another example that I found interesting, the movie Us by Jordan Peele. I'd like you to listen to what he says.
The problem with Us, and I guess slight spoilers here, is that come the ending, it all kind of starts to collapse on itself because they begin to over-explain the premise. And when you over-explain the premise, you as a viewer look back and you're thinking to yourself, wait, that doesn't, but if that's the case, that doesn't make sense. What about that part back then and there, and that doesn't fully parse. The thing is that if I was given just a very vague answer or barely even an explanation, I think I would have liked it more, because when you over-explained it, now I'm calling into question so many things that happened before, and it starts to not make sense. I was totally fine with giving you my suspension of disbelief, but by over-explaining it, you lost me.
Did you catch that? Bricky didn't say a goddamn thing about the suspension of disbelief right there. His problem with Us was inconsistent writing and, I'm guessing, continuity issues. I don't actually know because I haven't seen the movie. But let's say that the issues in the movie were plugged up and the stuff that happens earlier in the movie is 100% consistent with the explanation of the premise that comes at the end, and it all makes logical sense. Would Bricky's argument still hold water? No, it wouldn't, because he's not actually complaining that the premise had a thorough explanation, even though that's what he thinks he's complaining about. What he actually doesn't like is that the explanation retroactively creates logical inconsistencies, which is not indicative of a structural issue, but of an issue with the execution. If more care was put into the writing of Us and the entire story fit together better, Bricky would be completely unable to criticize it from the over-explained perspective. And that to me makes me feel that this entire argument just falls apart under scrutiny. And then he just kind of moves on to the next factor he believes is required of the suspension of disbelief: enjoyability. Let's hear what he has to say.
Enjoyability. This one's much simpler than the last. If we go back to the original definition, one of the statements in there was, in order to believe it for the sake of enjoyment. When you're not engaged, you start to pick up on inconsistencies. You pick up on plot holes, and you make those nitpicks that much more important because you don't care, because you're bored and you're searching for something to think about.
Now, this is an interesting argument, and I have much less of an issue with this point than the last one. And that's because I actually kind of agree with it, but for a completely different reason. I just think that enjoyability, immersion, fun factor, whatever you want to call it, is important in general. Like, if a story fails to engage the audience, it has failed on a fundamental level. Also, it is absolutely true that fun factor does amplify the effectiveness of the suspension of disbelief. I actually referenced this in my Chrono Trigger video, where I pointed out that all the positives the game has going for it, both in story and gameplay, allowed me to kind of ignore the fact that the time travel mechanics contradicted themselves constantly. It's a legitimate writing flaw, and a pretty significant one at that, but everything else is just fun, to the point where it didn't seriously bother me. However, I have to sort of reiterate the point I made as a response to Bricky's criticism of Us. Yes, it is true that a lack of engagement will make the plot holes, contrivances, and inconsistencies stand out, but what if those flaws simply didn't exist? What if the story was on a structural level free of any actual errors and was just not particularly engaging? Again, that would be an issue because engagement is important, but that's not an issue with the suspension of disbelief or with the thing you're suspending your disbelief for. It's a much broader issue that focuses more on the presentation of a piece of media, which in my eyes is an entirely different topic of discussion. I think the big issue here is that I view the suspension of disbelief and what makes it good or bad differently than Bricky does, and as a result, his arguments are simply not very convincing to me. Personally, I think the biggest factor in what makes the suspension of disbelief work is in how central the particular thing you're supposed to suspend disbelief for is to the fictional universe, or at least to the plot at hand. Let's go back to the example of magic. I've mentioned that I particularly like hard magic systems, at least when they're executed well, and I feel that in a well-executed hard magic system, there's usually not that much widespread suspension of disbelief. The suspension of disbelief stops at magic exists and it works under these limitations. Anything else that is unrealistic is not something you have to individually suspend disbelief for, but is instead a logical extension of that initial core concept. Where I feel suspension of disbelief tends to fail is when it's meant to cover up random other fantastical elements to a story. A key offender is Harry Potter. Now, I really like Harry Potter, and it's a great example of fun factor being able to cover up other issues, but it doesn't take a genius to realize its magic system is all over the fucking place. It's kind of in the middle in terms of hard versus soft, but J.K. Rowling would just kind of add in rules every so often, and you never really had a solid idea of what magic could do or couldn't do. Also, the Harry Potter universe just loved to basically say, oh yeah, there's a spell and or magic thing for that, which is fun enough in the moment, but incredibly frustrating when looking at it critically. Again, the issue to me is that suspension of disbelief typically works best when it's used sparingly and only as necessary. But there is one more thing I need to talk about, and you may have noticed something interesting if you've been paying attention. I'm responding to a video titled Suspension of Disbelief and Edd and Eddy, but I've barely spared 2 words for Edd and Eddy. Well, the way Bricky's video is structured is that the first half talks about the suspension of disbelief, and the second half ties it into the show. And I actually don't really have all that much of an issue with what he says when he's talking about Edd and Eddy specifically. That being said, this is kind of a case where I agree with his conclusions, that being that the show handled suspension of disbelief well in 2 episodes he highlighted, but I arrived there in a different way. It should be no surprise by now that I think his whole outlook on the fundamentals of the suspension of disbelief is flawed, so then why do I agree with his conclusions about the show? Well, if you've never seen Edd and Eddy, first of all, you're doing yourself a massive disservice. Fucking watch it. But this is a show that has a lot of absurdist comedy and cartoon slapstick humor, and these 2 things tie in exceptionally well to the elements of suspension of disbelief that Bricky discussed in the first half of his video. The thing is, one of the core factors in absurdist humor is right in the name. It's absurd. It inherently makes no fucking sense, so trying to logically explain something in an absurdist comedy would be completely going against the entire point. And slapstick is a bunch of goofy fun. A lot of times, a slapstick comedy will deliberately eschew realism for the sake of humor. But the fact that we're all having a good time means we just don't really care. And that's all I really wanted to talk about as far as Bricky's coverage of Edd and Eddy. I didn't really have any major problems with that point of the video. So in conclusion, I have to reiterate what I said earlier. Bricky, on the off chance you're actually watching this video, I'm still a fan. I still think you're a good YouTuber. This video just kinda missed the mark. I think the core premise was flawed, but hey, it inspired the video you're watching right now, so I actually appreciate it. Again, this video isn't me calling Bricky out, it's criticism of his ideas, which is something I think has been somewhat lost in the modern YouTube landscape. In any case, thanks for watching. Special thank you to my patrons, especially my God tier patrons Spawn, Bulk Squat Thrust, and Michael Rotolo. If you'd like to join them and get early access to future content, link is in the description. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more content. I would also love to hear your thoughts on this topic in the comments. Follow me on Twitter at @adstweets and join the Discord server linked below. I've got a lot of good stuff coming up that I'm really excited for. Future's looking bright for my content and I can't wait to share it all with you in due time. Once again, thank you all for watching and I'll see you next time. Play the electro swing.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back.